Uh, Thank you to all the comrades and friends who are here, who are active with the party, with the Answer Coalition, with other mass organizations who helped build, for instance, the important demonstration on May Day. We did that not just in Los Angeles, but all around the country where there were powerful actions of workers, labor movement, the Occupy movement, the immigrant rights movement, and others. Something very significant for our topic because we're talking about the prospects for the revival or renewal of a socialist movement. And May Day, May 1st, International Workers' Day, was celebrated and is celebrated all over the world, literally all over the world, but was not celebrated in the United States, even though May 1st and May Day originated with the struggle of workers in Chicago for the 8-hour day. And the reason that it's not celebrated here is not accidental. It's part of the long effort by the U.S. capitalist ruling class to eliminate consciousness about socialism, about worker solidarity, and all of the symbols or icons associated with it, like May Day, or International Working Women's Day, March 8th. In fact, for a long time in the United States, May 1st was celebrated as Law and Order Day, as a substitute for International Workers' Day, as part of this effort to eliminate consciousness. So the subject that I have, the subject that I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about it in a historical perspective, is the question of all questions for us as a revolutionary socialist party is, can there be a revival, will there be a revival of a mass socialist movement? Not simply the existence of a socialist party, but the revival of a mass socialist movement in the United States. And in order to examine that question, we have to understand, and I think it's extremely important for all of our members and people who are part of the movement, to have a historical understanding of why the socialist movement is as it is in the United States. I think if you ask most people in the country, have you ever heard of the existence of a communist party in the United States, or the PSL? Most people might say no. They might not even think that there is a socialist or communist movement in the United States. They may think that socialism and communism is something for other places. The Soviet Union in the past, or the People's Republic of China in the past, or Cuba, or Vietnam, or North Korea, someplace else but not here. And the thing that people in the United States don't know, and I'm guessing that even comrades in this room might not know, is that up until 1946, 1947, 1948, there was a very large communist and socialist movement in the United States. In Los Angeles, the Communist Party in Los Angeles, the Communist Party USA, had 5,000 members in 1947, 48. And people who weren't in the party but sympathized with the party was probably 10 times that number just in Los Angeles. Most of the unions in the United States, not most, but almost most, of the unions in the United States were led by communists up until 1946 and 47. If you look at the preamble to their constitutions, the goal of the union is not simply for better wages and better benefits, but many of the unions had in their preambles that their goal was the elimination of wage slavery. That's what communists say, what we're fighting for, the end of wage slavery. In the South, the black freedom movement in the 1930s and into the 1940s was led fundamentally by the communist movement. In Alabama, in Georgia, in Mississippi, and throughout the South, the black led mass movement against KKK terror and against the police state in the South was led by communists. The NAACP and the more what we know to be the mainstream sort of moderate clergy-led black organizations were not considered the vanguard of the civil rights movement in the South in the 1930s and early 1940s. That would be the Communist Party and the organizations it created. So if we're going to ask the question, can there be a revival or will there be a revival of the socialist movement in the United States, we have to understand why that movement, which was so strong, got smashed. How was it crushed? Was it crushed? I don't think most people know actually what happened to the history, to the actual movement, our movement, the workers' movement, the communist movement. So I'm going to talk about that. And I think it's important to understand it because if we don't understand that, and we say we're for the revival of a socialist movement and don't understand what actually happened to the real existing communist and socialist movement before, we're just it's kind of a matter of wishful thinking. There's no real consciousness or thought or strategic planning based on what happened to the movement that would allow us to revive the movement. The communist movement became very strong in the 1930s in the United States, and there was a workers' mass movement led by communists fundamentally, some socialists too, but mostly the communists, as part of the global economic contraction, the depression of the 1930s. We're in a depression today. They say it's the Great Recession, blah, blah, blah. It is a depression for huge parts of the population. The real number of unemployed in the United States today, the real number is about 20%. That is people who would like to be working but can't find work. If you go down this, if you're unemployed and go down the street and mow your neighbor's lawn, the Department of Labor counts you as employed. So when you factor in the severely underemployed people, the number of unemployed people is 20%. The official number of unemployed in the 1930s was 25%. It was more, but not that much more. Now that economic crisis in the United States, in the Depression, was also felt in Europe. It was felt everywhere, just like today's economic crisis. And as the capitalist stock market crashed, and as the capitalist economy led to just more and more intractable unemployment, the fate of the communist movement, its fate increased, its prospects increased. It became a mass movement everywhere. And there was the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union, which of course is the most demonized society in modern history, in the time of the Great Depression, had no unemployment. In fact, it had an 8, 10, 12% growth rate every year. There was a labor shortage in the Soviet Union. Workers, thousands of skilled workers from the United States, including many African-American skilled workers, left the United States and moved to Russia, moved to the Soviet Union to find employment. That elevated the prestige of the Soviet Union, that while the capitalist world was unemployed everywhere, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the United States, everywhere, no unemployment in the Soviet Union. They had eliminated private ownership. They had a different kind of economic model. They weren't based on profit. Every worker had a right to a job. Every worker had a right to health care. Every worker had a right to education. In the time of an economic depression, that made the Soviet Union very attractive. And so communism in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere grew because of the example, the living example of the Soviet Union in contrast with the capitalist world. And also because the capitalists said to the unemployed, you can vote every 4 years, but you don't have the right to a job. And the pressing issue for the unemployed is not to vote, it's to work. Not that people don't want to vote, but they want to work. They need to be able to feed their families. And so the communist movement all around the world grew in the 1930s, including in the United States. The Communist Party, at the beginning of the Depression, had 10,000 members. By 1939, it had 100,000 members. It continued to grow into and through World War II. And as I said, at the end of World War II, the communists were in a commanding position in the unions, in the black civil rights movement, in most of the movements. Now, the cause of the Depression, from our point of view, from a Marxist point of view, was something called the crisis of overproduction. Because capitalism is producing goods and services not to meet human need, but to realize a profit for the private property owners, when those goods couldn't be sold, the people were laid off, the workers were laid off. And once laid off, they couldn't have an income to buy other goods. And the ripple effect went through the whole economy, and suddenly the contraction was so universalized that you had a depression, as we have experienced in the last few years. And there was no way for the capitalists to solve the problem of overproduction. Too much was produced. Just think of it. Too much food? How could that be? How can you produce too much food? Too many clothes? Too many homes? I mean, how is it possible when there's all this unmet human need, you can have a system that shuts down not because of scarcity, but because too much was produced. But of course it was too much to produce, not from the point of view of the standard of what human beings need, but from what the capitalists could sell for a profit. And so the capitalist system broke down. Now, the capitalists solved the problem of overproduction not by Rooseveltian pump priming, creating new jobs like the WPA and other programs. Roosevelt created 11 jobs by public financing. That was a lot of jobs. But there was still a depression. The only way the depression came to an end finally, the only way the crisis of overproduction was ended, was World War II. Two things happened in World War II. All the unemployed could have a job because they were all made into soldiers. And then they could go shoot other workers who were unemployed but now employed as soldiers, as the capitalists competed with each other for who would dominate Africa and Asia and the Middle East and Latin America and each other. And finally, the crisis of overproduction was solved because all of the means of production in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, were destroyed by bombs and by war. And so all of the achievements of capitalism, the cities, the great urban centers of modern capitalism, were basically wiped out. And you know how many people died in World War II? About 70 to 80 million human beings died in that 5-year period. 70 to 80 million. I mean, we think about the Iraq War and the casualties. I mean, compared to what the carnage was of World War II, it's so minuscule in comparison from a quantitative point of view. But that had the effect of overcoming the problem of overproduction because everything was destroyed and capitalism had a chance to start over. That's not a very good sort of recommendation for a social system, that the only way it can solve its crisis is to destroy the whole world. But in fact, that's what it did. Except there was one country in the world that wasn't destroyed. And that one country was the United States of America, protected by 2 vast oceans, unable to be invaded, unable to be bombed, while the rest of the capitalist world was destroyed. The American factories were humming. The cities were untouched. It was intact. And at the end of World War II, U.S. capitalism, now in the form of an empire, resuscitated all of its defeated enemies and allies, Japan, Germany, Italy, France, the UK, which wasn't completely destroyed but had been greatly weakened. And so, at the end of World War II, 1945, the United States population constituted 6% of the world's population. Just remember that number. The U.S. constituted 6% of the world's population. But the United States, under those circumstances, where everything else had been destroyed, the United States produced 1 out of every 2 goods and services in the world. 50% of all of world production took place in the United States, and 6% of the people of the world lived in the United States. So the U.S. capitalist class, under those circumstances, amassed a fortune unlike any ruling class had amassed in human history. And with that fortune, it was able to provide some benefits for a sector of the U.S. working class which 10 years earlier had been completely pauperized, had been completely unemployed, was impoverished, was living in misery, thousands dying of starvation. Suddenly, under the circumstances where 6% of the people of the world were enjoying an economic boom where they constituted 50% of the world's product, a sector of the U.S. working class started to be given what would be considered, by working class standards, a relative affluence. People could start to move to the suburbs. People could start to own automobiles. Workers could go to college for the first time. Workers could think that their children would go to college for the first time. Instead of being a completely impoverished working class, a sector of the U.S. working class achieved relative affluence. And who was that sector? It was predominantly the white working class, or big sectors of the white working class. Now, it was under those economic circumstances that the United States government initiated a global offensive against communism that we call now, or you'll see in school and high school or college, they call it the Cold War. It was not so cold for the people in Korea or China or Vietnam where millions died. But it was a global confrontation against communism waged by the United States. And the domestic part of the Cold War was to make it illegal to be a communist in the United States. 1,000 people in the United States went to prison for being socialists. The leaders of the Communist Party were sent to prison for 10, 12 years just for being leaders of the Communist Party. Thousands, tens of thousands of working people and middle-class people lost their jobs because they had signed a petition from a mass organization like Answer, if it had some association with the communist movement. In Hollywood, all of the progressive actors and screenwriters were driven out of Hollywood in the so-called witch hunt or blacklisting. Scientists all over academia were driven out. The Communist Party, which had been 100,000, as I said, in 1945, by 1952 was down to 5,000 members. 95% of the party left under the blows of the anti-communist witch hunt. The Rosenbergs, 2 workers in New York who were leading struggles against the Korean War, were executed on the premise that they had given the Soviets the secret to the atomic bomb on the back of a matchbox. You know how that works. But they were executed. They were executed. Just think if leaders of our movement right now were called traitors and taken and publicly executed, or executed after a long public campaign, and then thousands of others were driven out of their jobs and tens of thousands left the country, you can see a lot of people would think twice about being in the movement. But that happened at the same time that a big sector of the U.S. working class was also gaining benefits from capitalism. That was the first time in a long time, certainly not in the Depression, that a big sector of the working class could point to the same system that the capitalists used to exploit them and say, okay, maybe I'm exploited, but you know what? I just got a house in the suburbs. Matter of fact, I can afford a second car. I can go to college. My children can go to college, and no working class kids ever went to college up until that time. And the GI Bill was introduced, the biggest affirmative action program in U.S. history, where anybody who was a soldier in World War II got a right to go to college for free. Can you imagine? A whole generation of oppressed workers suddenly saw a definite improvement in their living standards. So the witch hunt, the anti-communist witch hunt, coincided with this relative affluence, at least for a sector of the U.S. working class. That's what did in the communist movement. If it had just been repression, but the lives of the working class were being ground down, or all the working class were being ground down, people would say, well, yeah, they're repressing us, but we still can't make ends meet. We still can't live. We can't feed our families. And they would fight against the repression. They'd fight against the anti-communism. But the combination of fear of the Soviet Union, the fear of thermonuclear war, the relative affluence that a sector, principally the white workers, started to achieve, and the attacks on the communist movement led to the destruction of the communist movement as we knew it at that time. Now, did that stop the resistance movement in the United States? No. Matter of fact, just at that moment, a new social development took place that was the most profound social development in U.S. history, and that was the rise of the black nation in the southern part of the United States fighting for equality, fighting against segregation, fighting against apartheid, fighting against the police state that ruled the southern part of the United States. And suddenly the black masses of people in the South rose up, and that started principally in 1955. The new resistance during the 50s took place not in New York, not in San Francisco, not in Berkeley, not in Los Angeles, but in Montgomery, Alabama, of all places, where the people lived under the heel of a police state. But the communists who had led that movement in the South could not lead the movement in the 50s because of this anti-communist assault. And so a new leadership emerged, and it was led, the new leadership was principally the black African-American clergy in the South, who, because they were religious people, were also able to function politically. In other words, you have a church. You can gather together on Sundays or other nights. It's not the same as organizing Communist Party meetings in Alabama, which would have been raided by the Klan, shot down, shot up, people arrested. The church gave a little bit of a safe haven. So this mass revolutionary black movement took off, but without the leadership of the communists. And then what followed was in Vietnam, a mass anti-war movement came. And again, it was not led by the communists because the communists were still considered persona non grata. All the liberal groups didn't want to touch the Communist Party, even though it had been the traditional leader of the peace movement, or the Socialist Party, or the Socialist Workers' Party, or any of the other socialist parties. And then there was the women's movement. And then there was a gay movement. And there was a disabled movement. There have been so many mass movements that are either issue-oriented or constituency-based mass movements that grew up in the same time period that I'm talking about, that have created profound change in America. Profound change. I mean, look at what President Obama did a couple days ago. Yes, it was a maneuver. Yes, it was cagey. Yes, it was partly opportunistic. all that thing, but the President of the United States endorsing gay marriage, that's a profound historic event. That would have been unheard of. Nobody could have possibly predicted it. And the fact that the President of the United States is a black man, whose name is Barack Obama, also hard to have been predicted 5 or 6 years ago. What's that all about? That's about the huge movement for social change led by people who won't go back. The black community first and foremost, and then women, and then the gay and lesbian and bi and trans community, that all taking inspiration from each other's struggle for democratic rights have created a profound change in America. I mean, of course, there's still oppression, severe oppression, and all of that, but it would be wrong on our part not to recognize that there's a change and that the change came about from the mass movement. But these issue-oriented and constituency-based mass movements were issue-oriented and not movements against capitalism. If the communist movement had led the gay movement, or the women's movement, or the civil rights movement, it would have been a movement for rights, but it would have also been a movement against the capitalist system. It would have been part of the generalized movement. Instead of black people fighting for black rights, and Mexican Americans fighting for Mexican American rights, and gay people fighting for gay rights, and disabled, in other words, all of these constituency-based movements, the old movement was everyone together. The socialist-led workers' movement was the movement fighting for civil rights and women's rights and peace. The absence of the communist movement didn't stop the resistance movement, but it changed its political coloration, its orientation. And so now we have new movements that have grown up. Again, very unexpected, the movement of the undocumented. Just think about that. Who would have thought that the biggest political general strike in the United States in the last 100 years would be led by people who could at any moment be deported? I mean, just think about that. I mean, the people with the most to lose, the most vulnerable, suddenly rising up as immigrants. But you noticed in 2006 when that movement started, the immigrants fought heroically, created that thing, but the non-immigrants were not there. I mean, we were there, the vanguard organizations that were there, but generally speaking, again, it was an issue-oriented, constituency-based movement, not a broad movement against the entire system. So I'm saying all of these things, comrades, because I think it's extremely important for us to look at the trajectory of what has come before us in the last 6 decades that has weakened the communist movement, so that as we discuss its revival, we can see, well, is it wishful thinking, or is there something new going on? Is there, I mean, why won't this be just replicated over and over again for the next 50 years, where it's a women's movement, a gay movement, a disabled movement, an African American movement, you know, like that? Why would we think that it will be transformative and come back to where it was a socialist, anti-capitalist movement? Well, lacking a crystal ball, we can't really make predictions. Well, I am going to make a prediction, but it's not exact. You know, this old cliche: don't make predictions, especially about the future. The prediction is not simply like looking into the distance. It has to be based on what we see now. I think when we saw the Occupy movement come into formation, the slogans of the movement, just think, this was just last September, October, it seems like a long time ago, and so much has changed. The police raids on all those encampments really has had a very, very big impact, I think. It's not the encampment per se, but the encampments were sort of a center that became a magnet for other energy, like the labor movement, the immigrant rights movement. But Occupy took off with the first movement that wasn't issue-oriented and is not constituency-based. It's a movement of people. It was a and it caught on. The slogan caught on. Like everybody's using the slogan of the 99% and the 1%. We think the Occupy movement was a harbinger of what's coming. We're not infatuated with the Occupy movement. We're not saying it's without contradictions. We know all of its contradictions, its defects, and we also know that the police are infiltrating it and carrying out tactics in some instances designed to discredit the movement. We saw that on May Day. Severe police provocateur actions in Seattle, in Oakland, this so-called bomb plot in Cleveland where the Occupy movement was. Each of those bomb plots are always conceived of by the FBI, and some group of fools, you know, says things the wrong way, or they get excited, or talk big, or you know, whatever, and then they spend the rest of their life in prison. But meanwhile, the FBI gets some headlines. The Occupy movement wants to bomb things or something. You know, it's all crap. But that's part of the operation right now. The government shut it down, arrested 7,000 people, broke up the encampments, now is putting provocateurs in. They want to do to the Occupy movement what they've done to other movements, like the communist movement in the past. They want to discredit it. They're hoping it goes away. But will it go away? Well, in some ways, it's quieted down a little bit. There's a lot of Occupy activity going on, but it's a little bit quieter. But it's also coinciding with the election, the 2012 election. During the election campaign, everybody gets sucked into the process. Like, if you don't elect Obama, whatever his defects, you're going to have Romney. And from a pragmatic point of view, it makes sense in some ways to think like, yeah, let's have Obama. We know he's a capitalist. We know he's pro-big business. We know this. But let's face facts. I mean, he is for gay marriage. He's recognizing climate change. The only no Republican candidate in the primaries would even acknowledge that there's such a thing as climate change, global warming. There was one Republican who did say that there was climate change, and that was Michelle Bachmann. She said there is global warming, and it's because God is punishing us for gay rights. So, I mean, that's the Republican. I mean, when you look at the Republican field, it's, you know, you can see why people would like it. I mean, while 30, 40 million people unemployed, the main topic was how to get rid of contraception. I mean, you know, I mean, it's just like you could see why people would go. So naturally, right before the election, things kind of quiet down in terms of street struggles a lot of times, because the energy gets focused into electing the Democrats. But from our point of view, from the PSL's point of view, we think it's extremely important that President Obama was elected. Even though we ran our own candidates against the Democrats and Republicans, just as we are now. We're running Peta Lindsay and Jody Osario against the Democrats and the Republicans. And you know, if it's a close election, and in Florida or something like that, Pete, if you get like just even 5,000 votes and Obama loses the state of Florida by 4,000, people will say, you helped bring this right-wing Republican. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. And people will say, okay, now Roe v. Wade, gay rights, civil rights, all because of PETA. All down the tube. Like that's how the Democrats will. And a lot of people think, yeah, that's like, I would have voted for Obama, but I had the chance to vote for PETA, so I pulled the lever. So why are we running? I mean, we can't win. And some people say that even if we did win, that because PETA's 28 years old, she's not constitutionally able to be president because you have to be 35.
Yeah.
Which, you know, that's a ridiculously undemocratic law from our point of view. I mean, when they passed that Constitution and made that the requirement, the average life expectancy in the United States was 37. So, by that standard, the minimum age now should be about 74 to be president. But so then why are we running? We're running because, not because we don't see all the things that everybody who's going to vote for Obama sees. We do see those things. We see all those pragmatic, practical things that they're talking about. But we're trying to revive the socialist movement. We know that the only way to really go forward for the working class is through the socialist movement, through the movement of the socialist working class against capitalism. Not simply a movement for rights, but a movement against the system of capitalism, which is creating the unemployment, the foreclosures, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why is it important that Obama was elected? When Obama came into office in 2009, you remember all the euphoria. Did anybody here vote for Obama?
Here, I'll throw my hand up.
Okay.
It happened.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, that's, like, if you were, I mean, there would be a huge number of people, I think a huge number of people in the PSL, because our party is mainly younger comrades, they were voting for the first time. They were like, it felt like a grassroots movement. Obama was not Bush, which is, you can't. He was a black man. He was a Democrat, not a Republican, a liberal by comparison to the Republicans. Said the war in Iraq was wrong. I mean, those were all kind of good enough reasons, and it felt like a mass movement. All the euphoria, remember, like on January 20th, we were in Washington at the inauguration. There were 3 million people there. When Bush got in that, you know, at the end of every, when the president leaves Washington, at the end he says goodbye, and then he gets in a helicopter, the ceremonial sort of, he flies away. And, you know, literally millions of people were there giving him the fingers and booing. I mean, there was so much excitement because you felt like not only was Bush leaving, but maybe the Bush era was leaving. Maybe there was going to be really something different. So we have this experience. This is why it was important that Obama be elected. We have the experience. A black man, not a Republican, a Democrat, pro-change against the Iraq war. 4 years later, we can evaluate what did it mean for President Obama to be president. The number of uninsured people, in spite of the fact that Obama wanted everyone to be insured, the number of people who can't go to a doctor when they're sick, which was 47 million in 2009, is now 51 million. The number of unemployed is now 30 to 40 million. It's more than when Bush was in office. The number of people, by the way, who were deported last year is much higher. About 1 million, I think, is the number, compared to when Bush was president. The number of people who lost their homes this year under Obama is much greater than during Bush. 2.3 million families were evicted, were foreclosed. 9 million are threatened with foreclosure. 9 million families. That's like 30, 40 million people when you count kids, just thrown out. Not because the house is no good, not because it's leaking, not because it was a fire, but because they can't pay the banks, so they're going to lose their homes. I mean, we have the experience of Obama, which we would never have had if he had not been elected, to see that the problems that we're talking about are not the problems of a politician. They're not the problems of the personality. They are the problems of the capitalist system. So from a point of view of the revival of socialism, it is extremely important that Obama was elected so that people could see electing a Democrat, even an African-American liberal Democrat, is not a solution because the problem is beyond the politicians. The problem is the social and economic order called capitalism. And from our point of view, consciousness, like if I said this to people in 2008, they would say, oh, that sounds good. Maybe you're living in an ivory tower, but we're gonna vote for Obama because, like all those reasons that I said. But now we have the experience. people's consciousness changes because they have to go through the experience, not because somebody lectured them. They have to go through a real life experience in all things. Just like when workers say, oh, you PSL, you're so anti-police. You know, you're like, I have friends who are cops, and why you guys are always talking about the cops this, and then you're like so hard line, but then you take those same people and you put them on a strike, and the police, when the bosses call to get scabs in, the police come and they knock them over the head with a baton or arrest them just because they were trying to save their jobs. The same people say, those pigs, you know, like they'll be more militant than the PSL because the whole idealistic conception that they may have had of the police, if they had an idealistic conception, is shattered based on their experience. Based on their experience. That's why the black community and the Latino community, when they see the police, they don't have warm, fuzzy thoughts about the police. The people think like, oh no, here comes the cops. This is going to be trouble. Where you have millions and millions of white people who, not having experienced racial profiling, not having experienced the terror of police brutality, they're like, yeah, cops, they're good. You know, why are you guys so hardline? But then, once they experience it, things change. So we needed to go through the Obama administration experience for the revival of socialism, because it also shows that the problems that we're facing as a class in society are not remediable by the normal channels of capitalism. We're back kind of where we were in the 1930s in a way, not exactly, but that's what it is. Now, I'm going to close on this, and then I want to open the floor for discussion. Who were the people in the Occupy movement? What was the social composition of the Occupy movement in the beginning, at least? A lot of them were 20-something college students, and a lot of them were probably had thought of themselves as middle class. But, you know, they can't find work. They have college degrees, they can't find work, or if they find work, it's not the job that they thought they were going to get. They're working just a few hours, they're barely able to make ends meet, and they're saddled with debt. They can't pay their student debts. And it's far different, in other words, than it was for that generation in 1945, 46, 47, 48. Remember when I talked, there was that relative affluence for a sector of the working class, particularly the white working class, as a consequence of the fact that the United States produced 50% of the world's product and only had 6% of the world's population. U.S. capitalism doesn't have that sort of supreme position as an empire, as an economic dominating force where it can just reward parts of its own working class with benefits or what might appear to be privileges by other people's standards. And so instead of relative affluence, the message of the capitalist class to the U.S. working class today is, everything that you got before, we're taking it back. Your pensions, the next generation won't have pensions. They're not going to have them. We were just talking, you have a pension. What a difference that you can go into your later years and not have to worry about impoverishment. Without the pension, that doesn't exist. All the new jobs that are being created, 40% of the new jobs that have been created in the last couple of years, they're temp jobs. They're not jobs with benefits. As soon as there's the slightest economic downturn, those college graduate young people who thought, or whose parents thought they were going to have a better, they're going to be right back to where they were. And they're going to be competing against another year of college graduates and another year and another year. And the bosses all think, I'll much rather hire a 22-year-old than a 29-year-old because I can pay them less. The capitalists are driving wages down, and the union movement that was the historic guardian of workers' wages and benefits in the United States, it's being driven down. And it's not just the Republicans. It's not just Scott Walker in Wisconsin. Cuomo in New York, who's a liberal Democrat, did the same things to the unions that Scott Walker did, virtually. It's a trend of the bourgeoisie. It's a trend of capitalism. So we think the Occupy movement is a harbinger of a new day. And that this movement, which says 99% and 1%, that's the beginning stage of a class-conscious movement that says The real problem isn't just rights, it's capitalism itself. And when you say the problem is capitalism, then you must have a solution. And there is only one solution. The solution is socialism, because socialism isn't rhetoric. I mean, most people, when you ask them what is socialism, they really can't give you a good answer. But it basically means, in contrast with capitalism, in capitalism, your right to work, my right to work, anyone's right to work, any worker's right to work is decided by a group of capitalists. They decide whether they will hire us. If they don't hire us, we could starve. Our children could go very hungry. That's what that's why Marx called it wage slavery. We're not enslaved to an individual slave owner, we're enslaved as a class to another class. If they don't hire us, we don't have wages, and if we don't have wages, we can't live, and our kids can't live, or not live well. And they have the right to decide whether we work or not. Socialism is the system that says every person has the right to work. That the right to employment and the goods and services we produce are not based on the needs of the capitalists to make profit, it's based on the needs of the people to live. That's the basic definition of what socialism is. It's taking the property from the capitalists and making it social property, so everyone can have that right. Now, that's the only place that this can go as a solution. So as the movement becomes a general movement against the 1%, it seeks solutions, and the solutions are only in the socialist program. So we believe that this is the beginning of a new day. We believe the socialist movement will revive. We want to have an organization that can not only promote socialist ideas, but actually help create the socialist society. That's what we're doing. And even though you might say, well, gee, you're 100 people or 300 people or 500 people, but, you know, can you really do all that? Well, you know, Rosa Parks and that movement, that revolutionary movement of black people, that was started by about 8 women. And they had met over and over again in churches. Their meetings were a lot smaller than this meeting. And they always said to each other, why don't the people wake up? Why don't they it's so frustrating. We come and we meet and meet and meet and meet, and we hand out flyers and nobody pays attention. They just say, yeah, okay. And they just keep going on with their lives. And it's like, they must have felt more frustrated than we did, because it was Alabama, where there was a big reason not to come to the meetings, because, you know, your house could be firebombed that night by the Klan. But they just kept going and going and persevering, and their time had come. The movement of the black civil rights movement had come. And we believe that Occupy is a harbinger of what's coming, and that the socialist movement must come as the only response to the capitalist crisis.